Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The words weren't loud, but they cut through the comfortable hum of conversation in the restaurant like a knife. It was the kind of voice that wasn't meant to cause a scene but carried just enough authority to make sure the person it was directed at knew there was no negotiation. Robert Downey Jr. didn't react right away. He sat there, fingers wrapped around the base of his untouched glass of water, elbows resting lightly on the edge of the table. He had been watching the way the waiter had approached, the way his posture was a little too stiff, the way his jaw was set like he had already decided how this would end. Robert finally looked up, locking eyes with the man standing over him. The waiter wasn't nervous. That was important. People who recognized him, really recognized him, were usually either excited, awkward, or cautious. This one wasn't any of those. He was confident, dismissive. He had already decided that Robert Downey Jr. was a problem that needed to be removed. Excuse me. Robert's voice was calm, smooth, but there was something underneath it, something that hinted at the fact that he wasn't just another customer being asked to leave. The waiter didn't flinch. I'm afraid this establishment has a certain standard, sir. We can't accommodate everyone. That was interesting. It wasn't a request. It wasn't, sir, would you mind stepping outside? It was a statement. An order. Robert let the silence stretch just long enough to make it uncomfortable, just long enough for the people at nearby tables to shift slightly in their seats, their conversation slowing as they started to take notice of what was happening. I have a reservation. His voice didn't rise, but there was an edge to it, the kind that would have made most people take a step back. The waiter smiled, but it was small, almost amused. I understand, but we have the right to refuse service when necessary. Robert exhaled through his nose, setting the glass down with a slow, deliberate movement. He knew this game. He had played it before, a long time ago, back when his name was only spoken in past tense, when people thought of him as a walking disaster instead of a success story. He had spent years proving that version of himself didn't exist anymore. But there would always be people who still saw him that way. He tilted his head slightly, studying the man in front of him. Let me guess. Someone told you I'd be here tonight. Someone made a call. The waiter didn't answer, but the briefest flicker of hesitation in his eyes was enough. Robert sat back in his chair, resting an arm over the back of it, looking more relaxed than he felt. And now you think this is your moment? Huh? The guy who gets to say he kicked Robert Downey Jr. out of a restaurant. The waiter's smile faded. Sir, if you don't leave, I will have to call security. There was a sharp silence now, the kind that made the air feel heavier. People were definitely listening. Someone at the bar was pretending not to stare. A couple at the table near the window had gone quiet, their wine glasses frozen midair. Robert ran his tongue along the inside of his cheek, inhaled slowly, and a chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. The sound was just sharp enough, just unexpected enough, that heads turned. A woman had stood up from one of the nearby tables, her movements deliberate. She wasn't looking at the waiter. She was looking straight at Robert. And the moment he saw her face, his stomach dropped. He hadn't seen her in years. She wasn't supposed to be here, but she was. And now everything about tonight had changed. She took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. He's with me. The waiter hesitated for the first time, glancing at her with a flicker of uncertainty. Unlike Robert, she was dressed in a way that fit the setting, an elegant black dress, understated jewelry, the kind of effortless sophistication that made people assume she belonged. She didn't wait for the waiter's response. She turned back to Robert, her expression unreadable. Come with me. Robert stayed seated for a second longer, studying her, trying to figure out why she was here, what she was doing, what was coming next. Then, finally, he pushed his chair back, stood up, and followed her. The waiter watched them go, his expression unreadable, but Robert didn't look back. He didn't need to. He already knew tonight wasn't going to end the way he had expected. Robert followed her without a word, his steps measured, controlled, even though his mind was already running through every possible reason for her being here. She walked ahead of him, moving with purpose, not looking back to see if he was keeping up. The restaurant felt even quieter now, the weight of curiosity hanging in the air from the people who had been listening in, but she didn't acknowledge them. She didn't hesitate. She didn't slow down. She reached a hallway near the back, past the main dining area where the noise softened, then turned sharply into a private lounge, pulling open the heavy wooden door and stepping inside like she owned the place. The moment Robert followed her in, she shut the door behind them. The space was dimly lit, a single long leather couch against one wall, a bar in the corner stocked with expensive bottles that no one was touching. It was empty except for the two of them, and that was when Robert knew This wasn't just about getting him away from the waiter. This was planned. She had been waiting. He stood still, watching her as she turned back toward him, crossing her arms over her chest, her eyes sharp, calculating, but not angry. Not yet. That was almost worse. He could handle anger. It was the quiet, measured control in her expression that unsettled him. "I wasn't expecting to see you tonight," he said finally, his voice even, giving her the opening to explain herself. She tilted her head slightly. "That makes two of us." Robert narrowed his eyes, studying her, waiting for her to get to the point. She was here for a reason, and she wasn't the type to waste time. If she had stepped in like that, if she had made a scene just to pull him into a private conversation, then it wasn't small. She exhaled, dropping her arms, pacing slightly before stopping in front of him again. "I need to know if you've heard anything." Robert raised an eyebrow. "About what?" She hesitated, and that was the first thing that unsettled him. She wasn't the type to hesitate. Finally, she looked at him again, and for the first time, he saw something else in her eyes. Not fear, exactly, but something close to it. "They're coming for you, Robert." He let the words settle for a moment, watching her face, looking for any sign that she was exaggerating. That this was some dramatic warning about a tabloid story or another attempt from some desperate nobody trying to make a name for themselves at his expense. But she wasn't being dramatic. She was serious. And that meant she was talking about something real. His voice was calm, steady. "Who?" She crossed her arms again, shifting slightly, looking like she was debating how much to say. "People who don't play by the rules. People who don't care about the truth. People who want you out of the way, and they finally have something they think will do it." Robert stayed silent, processing, trying to piece together what this was about. He had enemies, of course he did, but nothing that warranted this. Nothing that would have brought her here, after all these years. What do they have? She hesitated again. "A recording." Robert didn't react right away, but his fingers twitched slightly at his side. A recording. He had been careful for years, knowing that in his world, perception was more dangerous than reality. It didn't matter if something was true. It only mattered if people believed it. He kept his voice even. "And what does it say?" Her jaw tightened slightly. "Enough to ruin you." Robert exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You're going to have to be more specific than that." She didn't break eye contact, didn't back down. "It's you. Talking. But cut together, edited, manipulated to sound like something it isn't. And it's bad, Robert. Worse than anything they've tried before." Robert's stomach tightened, but his face remained unreadable. He had survived worse than rumors, had rebuilt himself from nothing more times than most people got the chance to, but this was different. If they had a recording, if they had proof, even if it was fake, then it didn't matter what was real. His voice dropped lower, sharp. "Who has it?" She hesitated for just a second too long, and that was when he knew. "It's not the press," she said, finally. "It's someone who wants control." That changed everything. If it had been a journalist, an opportunist looking for a payday, then it could have been handled. Buried. Bought. But if it was someone who didn't want money, someone who wanted leverage, then this wasn't about exposure. This was about ownership. Robert clenched his jaw slightly, his patience thinning. "What do they want?" She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "They haven't made a demand yet. But they will." Robert didn't move, didn't react, didn't let the weight of her words settle on his face. This was a game, one he had played before, but this time, someone else had made the first move. Someone who had been waiting. Someone who had already decided how this was supposed to end. And now, Robert had to decide what to do next. Robert didn't move, didn't react right away, but something shifted in his posture, a slight change in the way he carried himself, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. He had been through enough in his life to know that when someone came to you with a warning like this, it wasn't just a heads up, it was already happening. There was no time to sit back and process, no time to debate whether or not it was true. If she was here, if she had stepped in before things escalated, it meant the damage was already in motion. He studied her, looking for something in her expression that might tell him how deep this went, whether she was here as an ally or because she had no choice. He had known her long enough to recognize when she was holding back, and she was. There was more to this, something she wasn't saying, and that bothered him more than the warning itself. His voice was calm, steady. "How do you know all this?" She shifted slightly, crossing her arms over her chest, her fingers pressing into her skin as if she was holding something in place, holding something back. "Because I was there when they decided what to do with it." Robert exhaled slowly, keeping his face unreadable even as his thoughts moved faster, already calculating what this meant. If she had been there, if she had heard the discussion firsthand, It meant she was close enough to them to be trusted, which meant she wasn't just here as a messenger, she was part of this, whether she wanted to be or not. He kept his voice even, watching her closely. "And why are you telling me this now?" Her jaw tightened slightly, and for the first time, he saw something in her expression that wasn't control, it was something closer to guilt. "Because I didn't sign up for this." Robert didn't break eye contact, didn't let her off the hook. "But you knew about it." She didn't deny it. She didn't try to excuse herself. She just exhaled sharply and looked away for half a second before bringing her gaze back to his. "I didn't think they'd go through with it." Robert let that sit for a moment, considering her words, considering what they meant. She had known. Maybe not every detail, maybe not how far they were willing to go, but she had known enough to be here now, warning him. That meant she had let it happen until she realized she couldn't. That meant she was involved whether she admitted it or not. His fingers drummed lightly against the edge of the table, a quiet, controlled movement. "So tell me what I'm dealing with." She hesitated again, and that was what told him how serious this was. She was calculating, trying to figure out how much she should say, how much was safe, and that was when he knew this wasn't about some edited recording, some minor attempt at blackmail. This was bigger than that. Her voice was quieter now, but there was no hesitation when she finally spoke. "They're not going to release it to the press." That got his attention. He didn't move, but his focus sharpened, locked onto her. "Then what are they going to do?" She swallowed once, then met his gaze directly. "They're coming to collect." Robert exhaled slowly, considering those words, turning them over in his mind. He had spent enough time in this world to understand what that meant. They weren't looking for a payout, weren't trying to ruin him publicly, they wanted something from him, something they thought was worth more than exposing him. And that was worse. His voice didn't change. "What do they want?" She hesitated, and that was when he knew the answer was something he wasn't going to like. Finally, she spoke, and the words were worse than anything he had imagined. "They want you under control." Robert didn't react right away, but inside, everything went quiet. That told him everything. This wasn't an attack. It was a move. A calculated, precise play designed to force him into a position where he had no choice but to do what they wanted. They weren't after his reputation, his career, or even his money. They were after him. He exhaled once, slow, controlled. "Who's behind it?" She shook her head slightly. "You already know." And that was when Robert realized this wasn't just another power move. This was personal. This had been in motion for longer than he had known, longer than he had even seen coming. And now, he had to decide how to play the next move. Because if they thought they could own him, they had already made their first mistake. Robert let her words sit between them, unmoving, unreadable, while every part of his mind worked to untangle what this really meant. If they wanted control, if they weren't planning on releasing the recording but using it as leverage instead, it meant this wasn't about public destruction. It was about private obedience. That was worse. That meant whoever was behind it wasn't after a scandal, wasn't trying to cash in on a desperate headline, wasn't looking for a one-time payout. This was calculated, patient, the kind of threat that didn't go away with a lawyer or a well-worded statement. This was designed to put him in a position where he couldn't say no. His voice was low, steady, sharp. "Tell me who's pulling the strings." She didn't flinch, didn't shift in her seat, but she hesitated for a second too long. That was enough. She knew. She had always known. She had come here with that information, had decided before she ever stepped into the restaurant whether or not she was going to tell him, and she was still deciding even now. That meant she was still afraid. Robert exhaled slowly. "If you don't tell me now, you're not protecting me. You're making me walk into something blind. You already made that choice once. You don't get to make it again." Her jaw tightened, and for the first time, something flickered across her face, something close to regret. Not for warning him, she didn't regret that. She regretted what she had been a part of before this moment, the part where she had watched from the inside, where she had let things go further than she ever should have, because she thought it wouldn't come to this. She finally looked at him, exhaled once, then said the name. Robert didn't react. Not at first. But something in his chest went cold. Because he hadn't been wrong, it was personal. He let his fingers press against the edge of the table for just a second before he spoke, his voice quiet. "That doesn't make sense." She gave him a look. "It does. You just didn't see it coming." Robert shook his head slightly, not in denial, but because he was already running through the last few months, looking for the signs, the patterns, the small, careful steps that had led to this. He should have caught it. He should have noticed. He had spent years making sure he was always ahead of these kinds of moves, always a step in front of the people who wanted to control him, and somehow, They had gotten this close without him realizing. That meant they had been patient. That meant they had planned for this longer than he had even known. His voice was sharp now. What's the demand? She hesitated again, but she had already crossed the line where she could hold anything back. They want you quiet, compliant, and when they need you, you show up. No questions, no negotiations. Robert exhaled slowly, shaking his head again, this time with something closer to amusement, but there was nothing funny about this. And what happens if I don't? She didn't answer right away, and that was when he knew there was no if. If he didn't do what they wanted, the recording was only the beginning. He finally leaned back, watching her, measuring her, letting the silence stretch before he spoke again. And what about you? Her brow furrowed slightly. What about me? You were there when they made the decision. You've been close enough to know every step of this before it happened. So what's your role in all this? Her lips pressed together slightly, and for the first time, she looked away. I was supposed to make sure you agreed. Robert nodded slowly, absorbing that. She had been sent to control the situation before it got messy. She was the insurance. The one person they thought he might listen to, the one person who could steer him in the right direction before they had to escalate things further. And if I say no? She finally looked back at him. Then you won't hear from me again. That told him everything. They hadn't sent her to negotiate. They had sent her to give him one last chance to fall in line before they decided for him. Robert sat there for another long moment, then finally pushed back his chair, standing slowly, adjusting the sleeve of his jacket like this was just another conversation, just another warning that wasn't going to land the way they wanted it to. They should have sent someone else, he said finally, voice even. Because you already knew I wasn't going to say yes. She exhaled, looking down for half a second before standing up too, but she didn't argue. She didn't try to push further. She had known, even before she had sat down, how this was going to end. Robert turned toward the door, stepping past her without another word, knowing that by the time he walked out of this room, the real game would begin. Robert stepped out of the private lounge without hesitation, his movements calm, deliberate, controlled, but inside, his mind was already moving at a speed he hadn't felt in years. The restaurant was still the same, dimly lit, filled with quiet conversations, glasses clinking, people who had no idea what had just happened in the room behind him. He didn't look around to see if anyone was still watching, didn't stop to acknowledge the waiter who had tried to have him removed, didn't check if she was following. She wouldn't. She had already played her role. Now, it was his turn. He moved through the restaurant with purpose, heading straight for the exit, stepping past tables filled with people who lived in a world that pretended everything was fair, that the people in power played by the same rules as everyone else. He knew better. He had learned a long time ago that in places like this, in circles like his, power wasn't about talent or hard work or even money. It was about control. And someone had decided they wanted to control him. The second he stepped outside, the air felt different, heavier, not because of anything physical, but because he knew that from this moment on, there was no more waiting. They had made their move. He had made his choice. Now, everything would start. He pulled his phone from his pocket as he walked, hitting a number he hadn't dialed in years, listening to the ring, waiting, knowing there was only one way this ended now. The voice on the other end answered quickly, no pleasantries, no hesitation. What's wrong? Robert didn't break stride. They made their move. A pause. Then, how bad? Robert exhaled through his nose. They think they've already won. The voice on the other end was silent for a moment, then finally, where are you now? Outside. Leaving. Go somewhere public. Don't go home. Robert already knew that. I need you to find the recording. Another pause. Then, I already have. Robert's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice stayed even. And, it's worse than you think. He didn't react, didn't let anything slip, just kept walking. Send it to me. There was another beat of silence, then the voice said, not over the phone. That told him everything he needed to know. If it was too dangerous to send directly, if even the delivery was being calculated, it meant the people behind this weren't playing reckless. They weren't making mistakes. That meant Robert couldn't afford to either. Where? Same place as before. Robert checked his watch, already recalculating his next steps. 20 minutes. The line went dead. Robert slid the phone back into his pocket, glancing once over his shoulder, not because he was paranoid, but because he wasn't. If they were watching, if they were tracking his next move, it wasn't going to be obvious. It wasn't going to be something as simple as a tail or a car parked on the corner with tinted windows. They had already gotten this far without him knowing. That meant they had been close for a long time. As he walked, he kept his pace normal, controlled, not giving anything away. He had spent years rebuilding himself, years making sure no one could use his past against him, years making sure the only person who could dictate his choices was him. But someone had decided to test that. Someone had decided they could push him into a position where he had no choice but to play along. They had made their move. Now it was his turn.